And another anecdote to just tell you why we're excited with this sector. If you look around in Indonesia and you ask somebody, hey, are you connected with the internet? They will probably say, not really, I don't think so. But are you on Facebook and Twitter? Yes, I think I have an account. So that's how people actually leapfrog to go to mobile first. And right now, a lot of people talk about the fourth industrial revolution, digitalization and all that. I think in Indonesia, the second, third, and fourth are going to be happening at the same time, in the next 10 years, right? And if you look at the infrastructure development, I think the political will is there, right? It takes 20 years to wait for MRT to go, and when the Governor Jokowi back then sit in the office 3 months, it is launched and it's being developed as we speak. And the same thing with all the things with toll road, power plants, and so on. Having said that, those things are not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, some will happen in 5 years, some will happen in 10 years. But this is where, technology, innovation will help to bridge the gap, so to speak.
In the banking sector, what does technology and innovation look like, and what impact will that have on Indonesia? And I know you've been a big proponent of financial inclusion.
Yeah, banking is about technology. I just want to share with you some numbers. In Mandiri, every month, we are serving 100 million of transactions. When I joined the bank back in 2006, it is around 50 million transactions per month. And at that time, 50% was done at the branch. 50% was done at the electronic channels, ATMs, internet banking, mobile banking. But now, out of 100 million transactions, 92 million is done through electronic channels. And I bet people like you, especially with your age, never come to bank branch for the last 3 months. So that is really the impact of technology in banking. So that is the reason why, starting last year, Mandiri established Mandiri Capital Indonesia. We already have one startup for mobile banking applications. We decided to put 50 million rupiah into this Mandiri Capital. We have a joint office with our partner in France, AXA, to open listening posts in San Francisco, in Beijing, in also Germany, Israel. Just to see what kind of fintech investment opportunity that we can invest. And to tell you the truth, we are spending hundreds of millions for IT because we are a large organizations. I try to do the same thing with the startup, the same projects, and they can do 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, and 10 times better. So for me, it's better to give it to the startup. So it's dangerous for my IT people. They can lose job quickly if they don't change.
So I'd like to ask the panel one more question, and then before that, I'll open up to the floor. So if you've got questions, please prepare and raise your hands, and we'll get a mic to be handed to you. But my question before we open it up to the floor is on the issue of terrorism. Last week, in Indonesia, there was a terrorist incident, as we all know. What are your reflections on that? And do you think Indonesia has done enough to combat that, Tom?
Yeah, if I may. There was a fantastic article in the Atlantic Monthly, I think many of us here may have seen it, right? Comparing and contrasting the response to terror attacks between the French government and the Indonesian government. Now, of course, you have to acknowledge that the scale of the attacks was quite different. Paris, something like 120, 130 people died. In Jakarta, thankfully, 7 people died, of which 5 were terrorists. Nevertheless, the rhetoric's so different. We responded with humility, I think, with soft-spokenness. I think the trending hashtag on Twitter was, "We are not afraid." Right? It was not, "We will crush you," or "We will destroy you." It was just simply, "We're not afraid," right? And the second, this is so typical of Indonesians, right? The second response was ultimately humor, right? And from the circulating photos of the satay vendor with his pushcart, calmly fanning his coals, right? And there's a great poster. It says like, "Keep calm and keep grilling satay." And again, and that humor extended eventually to mockery, which is Jakarta Governor Ahok saying, you terrorists, you're so dumb. You're a bunch of idiots. Like, you actually buy this, that by killing a whole bunch of people, you're going to get into heaven, right? But it offers a different approach to the world, I would say. It's not a militaristic response. It's not, a heavy-handed or, rhetoric of power, but one of soft-spokenness, very grounded, humor. I think it's something unique that Indonesia potentially has to offer in this effort to combat extremism and radicalism.
Would anyone else like to comment on that before?
Yes, I'm a banker, so I love to see the numbers. In France, in Paris, you understand that there are hundreds of victims and maybe 5 or 7 terrorists. In Indonesia, there are 2 victims and 5 terrorists dead. So there are two conclusions. Whether the terrorists in France are smarter or the police in Indonesia are smarter. Then you can choose.
Can I just
Please,
add a footnote here? And I think in this issue, frankly, Indonesia's role is extremely important. Now, I mentioned earlier on that ASEAN has created an ecosystem of peace. Why has ASEAN created an ecosystem of peace? And what I try to explain in my forthcoming book on ASEAN is that one reason is that Indonesia has shared its culture with the rest of Southeast Asia, and one specific example, the Musyawarah Mufakat, consultation and consensus. So the openness and inclusiveness of Indonesian society has actually been shared with the rest of Southeast Asia. And this is also very important because if you observe how Indonesia has reacted to the terrorism, it's very different from the way the rest of the world has reacted. I mean, the largest Islamic organization, Nahdlatul Ulama, with 50 million members, has actually directly confronted ISIS and said, you are wrong. Now, that's amazing. But what's even more amazing, everyone has mentioned Governor Ahok so many times. But in this world of today, when everyone thinks that a clash of civilizations is looming around the corner, in the capital city of the country with the world's largest Islamic population, the governor of the capital city is a Chinese Christian. Now, that's amazing. That shows an openness and tolerance that is actually the rest of the world can learn from. So reacting calmly to this terrorism threat is actually very important. And one fact, when I meet my American friends, I tell them, of course, you're more likely to die from a car accident and so on and so forth. But last year, the statistics are correct, if you lived in America, the likelihood is that you're more likely to be killed by your toaster because 40 people died from toaster accidents and 21 died from terrorism. So lock up your toaster.
Very well said. Questions from the floor, please.
Hi, I'm Richard Edelman. Question. What is the Indonesian government's view on whether the American military ought to have a presence in the Straits in order to just be around vis-a-vis China?
So President Jokowi said that we support freedom of navigation, right? He's also said that it's very important to us to avoid the South China Sea and certainly ASEAN from becoming a theater for great power competition, right? So as Dean Mahbubani has said, we always believe in consultation, in discussion and consensus. And I think, we've always been open. Obviously, Singapore does host American warships. I would like to point out that when the terrible 2004 tsunami hit, especially Indonesia, very, very hard, 200,000 people dead, the first people on the scene were the American Navy, right? And with military doctors and military medical supplies. So I think we always look very positively and always look on the bright side. But yes, we believe that we should work very hard at consultation, discussion, convening, such as the Shangri-La dialogues in Singapore. And certainly, whilst we appreciate the presence of, for example, the American Navy. I think we want to avoid as much as possible any move towards great power competition.
2 years ago, you banned the export of unprocessed ore to China. So given the current state of the market, where do you see that policy developing? Because that's a major thing.
Mr. Brodjonegoro, would you?
Yeah, okay. I think we are still consistent with our policy to ban the export of raw material. And actually it is much consistent now with our current president policy. I think our current president always mentioned that Indonesia really welcomes the investment, especially if the investment is in manufacturing and infrastructure. So not so much anymore about mining or agriculture. And the message is quite clear. We want Indonesia to be more industrialized, more manufacturing.
And yes, absolutely, we're sticking with the policy. And indeed, it dovetails quite nicely with President Jokowi's strategy to industrialize, right? Now, I just want to add something, which is the following. Basically, we stopped the export of raw ore, and we're forcing people to build smelters, right? Now, people tell me, Tom, this is very silly. Smelting is a terrible business. Margins in the business are like 1%, right? But the issue is not that. The issue is that without that intermediate step, we can't go further downstream, right? So basically, unless you have smelters, and yes, they are a terrible business, but unless you have them, you can't then proceed, as Minister Brodjonegoro said, to the downstream metals industries, the alloys, the basic parts and components that then feed into automotive, aerospace, and the like. Same with refineries, right? Refining is a terrible business. Refining margins have been negative for probably 10 years. Maybe now they're turning positive because crude oil has collapsed. But again, without that intermediate step, you can't go downstream. You can't go to the petrochemicals, then to the polyester staple fibers and so on. So this is a necessary evil. I would say that the hit to the exports that we suffered due to the ban, right, is a worthwhile investment in our long-term future as an industrial economy.
Bapak Anindya, what's your view from the perspective of the Chamber of Commerce?
I think going up the value chain is a good thing. And we also produce quite a lot of coal out of Indonesia. And the policy forces us to think a little bit more creatively. But that's okay because the domestic economy growth is there. For example, in the history of Indonesia, the electricity is about 58,000 megawatt, right? In the next 10 years, President Jokowi is trying to push 35,000 megawatt. They need all sorts of energy from coal, gas, and so on. So it works out quite well. But one thing that actually helps out for the country even more, other than, of course, you focus on domestic economy, you actually spread out the growth even more, right? So for example, if you look at South Sulawesi or South Sumatra, those are some of the provinces that show they want to grow even larger in terms of growth than the national growth, the GDP growth. And how do they do that? They do it by building infrastructure from power plants, toll roads, dams, and so on. And as a result, for example, like South Sulawesi, as everybody else in the region are still importing rice, they're actually exporting rice, outside and also inside the country. So that's just one of the examples that the decision to go up the value chain is actually a good thing.
Japan is hosting G7 this year. And what role do you expect Japan to play? And what kind of agenda do you want Japan and G7 to be discussing this year in G7?
Let me try to put the focus like this. I believe now the challenge of the G20 in the bigger picture is the relevance of G20 itself. And especially with the ambitious idea of having 2% additional growth in the next 5 years, that I believe it's quite impossible, during this gloomy period. So maybe what Japan can do in the G7, how to bring back the East Asia as the source of growth. I think somehow now the focus is more on the US because they think they are doing better. Europe is trying to, improving itself, but don't forget, if you still want the higher global growth in the future, or to meet this additional 2%, the only way is to have the whole East Asia moving on. So I think the support to make East Asia still as the source of global growth, I think it should be the most important topic in the G7.
As from banking perspective, now globally the regulatory regime is, make banks a very tough business. It's good in one way because it reduces the systemic risk of the global finance, but then it also reduces the appetite and the capacity for banks to do lending, especially to non-rated companies like SME and microbanking. It also reduces the capacity of banks to do trade. There should be a balance. Because if banks fail to do their main purpose, lending and trade, then the global economic growth will stay like this forever. So I understand that there should be a risk management for a global financial system should be there, but you should also balance with economic growth opportunities, especially for developing countries and small companies. So I think that is a good fit of thought for the G7 leaders.
We'll take the next question. I'll take a question from the gentleman in front and then in the back of the room.
What is the key point to complete the negotiation on the outset?
And TPP also.
TPP also. Yes, of course, Indonesia has shown a great interest in the TPP negotiation. So I would like to know that.
So thank you for the very good question. Actually, somehow I feel compelled to raise Dean Mahbubani's point earlier that, ASEAN, we often have a poor track record in implementation. And frankly, I think we Indonesians would often admit that over the last 10 years, 15 years, what have you, a lot of times that's where we fall down, right? Well, the good news is President Jokowi is all about implementation. It's all about execution, 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 right? And I think we've seen a lot of that already in the last 1 year. I think we're going to shift into a higher gear this year because he's consolidated power. I think the cabinet, the bureaucracy have gone through their period of adjustment. And basically, look, what is required for trade agreements, whether with Europe, with the European Union or with TPP, is basically policy reform, right? Well, policy reform, in my mind, is part of implementation execution, right? Like, it's the detail work, and unfortunately, I will have to impose on Finance Minister Brodjonegoro for a lot of coordinating meetings at the coordinating minister's office, because obviously policymaking is done by consensus also, coordination across the relevant ministries. But again, I think to answer your question, happy to report that I really think a lot of close observers in Indonesia would say there's a newfound energy and there's an intense focus on execution, execution, execution. It's getting to the point where one senior think tank head came to the vice president and complained, well, we swung from one extreme where, we had a lot of thinkers but no doers, and now your cabinet is all doers and no thinkers, So, we're going to have to maybe swing back a little bit. But yes, as finance minister can also confirm, we're often, up until 10 p.m., 11 p.m., going through the details of implementation and execution.
My question regarding the infrastructure in suburbs of Indonesia. What is the future thinking of our Honorable Finance Minister?
Well, look, I think Indonesia needs about, $450 billion to build the current infrastructure and all that. And maybe Indonesia has about 10-15% of that, so that's like almost the equity. But we need a lot more than that, right? And with the current interest rate that's still going on right now, and I know the government, Bank Indonesia, are trying to reduce that. It's going to be quite a challenge, but doesn't mean we cannot innovate or do something creatively to overcome that. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So first of all, when you do 30-40-year project, the IRR is about 15 to 17%, right? So you got to borrow much less than that, right? If it is too high, then it's very hard to do it. Now, this is where we see a lot of the Chinese involvement, with Asian Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, or the Japanese in the electricity especially really help a lot. Because one way to do it is, of course, by way of debt financing, but you can also do it by way of vendor financing. And that's what a lot of things in our experience, whether in our power plant, our toll road, really help us a lot. So I guess what I'm saying here is that infrastructure development, the political will is there. The money is there for the equity side, if you may say this thing. And I think creatively, working together with a lot of the countries that can be the vendors and long-term partner, I think there's a big opportunity to invest.
Yang Pak Jokowi clearly stated he want to have 35,000 megawatt of electricity. I'm a banker. I lend all of those guys. I know 35,000 multiplied by 2 million US per megawatt, 70 billion US. They want to build 1,000 kilometers of toll road. I know all the toll road company are my borrowers. So multiply by 10 million US, another 10 billion. 35 seaport, multiply by 1 billion US, 25 billion. I just want to share with you, all the fund available in the banking system of Indonesia is 4,300 trillion. The fund already committed for credit is 3,900 trillion. So the fund available is 400 trillion rupiah, or only 40 billion US dollar, less, depend on the exchange rate. So if you want to build 70 billion electricity power plant, you only have 40 billion left.
Indonesian infrastructure in the future should involve more private sector. So we will have, in the government, we will try to have more public-private partnership. And we want to see more private sector involved directly as the investor in the infrastructure. So I believe the opportunity is there, and once we have been able to build the trust with the private sector, I believe infrastructure will be one of the very promising business in Indonesia.
Just a few key takeaways before we leave this room. First, Vice President Joe Biden yesterday mentioned that we should move away from the concept of short-termism. I think that's what Indonesia requires now. If we look at Indonesia specifically on a quarterly basis, it might be challenging. But if you look at Indonesia from a medium to long-term perspective, I'm extremely optimistic. I'm optimistic, the group is optimistic, and the people here are optimistic. Number two, I think Indonesia, in terms of its human resources, I think Pak Andin spoke a little bit about it. Human resources for Indonesia is huge. Why? 50% of Indonesia is still under 30 years old. That's one. Two, look at the panelists here today. Every single ministers and the business leaders in Indonesia are of very young age. The human capital in Indonesia is so invaluable. And the future of Indonesia can only be brighter moving ahead. Thank you.